Tom Miller was a simple man who lived in a small town where life moved slowly, and everyone seemed to know one another, yet Tom preferred to keep to himself and focus on the little world he had built after tragedy changed his life forever, because 6 years ago he had lost his wife in a sudden accident on a rainy night, leaving him alone with a 3-year-old daughter and a heart that felt like it had been broken into pieces that could never be put back together, but Tom refused to give up. Because he knew Emily needed him, and that was enough to keep him moving forward every day even when it was hard. He ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, a place filled with the smell of engine oil, the sound of tools clanking, and the hum of old cars waiting to be fixed, and though the work was tiring, Tom found comfort in it because fixing engines was something he understood, something he could control when so much else in his life felt uncertain. His reputation in town was simple: he was honest, reliable, and kind, a man who never overcharged, who always explained what was wrong with a car in plain words, and who cared more about helping people than making a fortune, and though he did not have much money, he had enough to raise his daughter with dignity and truth. Emily was now 10 years old, a bright and gentle child with brown hair that always seemed to slip loose from her ponytail and a smile that reminded Tom of her mother in ways that were both comforting and painful, and she often spent her afternoons in the corner of the shop with her homework spread out on a little desk Tom had built for her, while Max, their loyal German shepherd, lay beside her like a silent guardian, his sharp eyes always watchful and his ears always listening for any sound that might mean danger. Max was not just a pet, he was family, a dog Tom's late brother had trained and given to him before passing away, and from the moment Max had stepped into their lives, he had been more than a companion, he had been a protector who seemed to understand his role was to keep Emily safe at all costs. Tom's days were long, his hands always stained with grease, his back often sore from bending over engines, but his heart was full when he watched his daughter grow, saw her laugh at something silly, or listened to her humming while she worked on her homework, because those small things reminded him that even in the middle of loss, life still gave gifts worth holding on to. The evenings in their house were quiet and steady, filled with simple meals, laughter that came in soft waves, and sometimes stories before bed, and Tom cherished that rhythm because it gave him peace, but fate has a way of stepping in when one least expects it, and one late evening, as the sun was melting into the horizon and the town was slowing down, Tom's world shifted in an instant. He was working under the hood of a customer's old truck, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, when Max suddenly stiffened, his ears pointing forward, his body tense, and then he let out a deep growl that made Tom immediately stand straight because he had learned to trust that dog's instincts without question. Emily looked up from her notebook, her small voice calling out, "Daddy, what's wrong?" But Tom raised his hand quickly and told her, "Stay inside, Em, don't come out," his voice firm, because the sound of Max's growl meant something serious. Tom stepped out of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, and his eyes moved toward the road just as the screech of tires filled the air, and he saw a car swerving wildly, as if the driver had lost control, the headlights bouncing as the vehicle fought to stay on the road. For a split second Tom's heart froze, because he could see disaster coming, and then it happened. The car veered sharply, smashing into the large oak tree that stood at the edge of his property, the impact echoing through the street with a sickening crash of twisting metal and shattering glass. Emily screamed from inside the shop, Max barked furiously and bolted toward the wreck, and Tom was already running, his boots pounding against the dirt, his chest tight with fear. When he reached the car, the sight before him stole his breath, because through the broken windshield and bent frame he saw a young woman slumped over the steering wheel, dressed in a torn police uniform, her badge catching the last light of the day as if to silently announce her duty even in this broken moment, and blood was dripping slowly down her face, her breathing shallow and ragged, her body trembling with weakness. Tom grabbed the car door, yanking hard, but it was jammed, the metal crushed inward, and his heart raced as Max barked louder, pacing as though urging him to move faster, while Emily's frightened voice called from the distance, "Dad, is she okay?" Tom shouted back, "Call 911 now," and Emily, her hands trembling, rushed to the phone inside. With a final, desperate pull, Tom forced the door open, the screech of metal loud in his ears, and he carefully leaned inside to unbuckle the seat belt, whispering calming words even though he did not know if she could hear him. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, glazed with pain, and she tried to speak but only managed a faint sound, and Tom quickly shook his head, telling her not to waste her strength. He lifted her as gently as his strong arms could manage, carrying her away from the wreck and laying her down on the grass, his jacket pressed against the wound in her side as he prayed silently that the ambulance would not take long. Her breaths were faint, each one sounding like a battle she might not win, and Tom, who had spent years fixing cars, now found himself begging for the strength to fix something far more fragile, a human life. "Stay with me," he whispered firmly, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "You're not alone, I've got you, just keep fighting." Max sat close, his nose brushing against the officer's hand as though to comfort her, his deep eyes full of a strange knowing, and in that moment, Tom realized that this night would not only test his strength but also change his life in ways he could not yet imagine, because sometimes fate crashes into us like a broken car, leaving us with no choice but to rise, act, and hold on with everything we have. Tom held the injured officer on the grass, pressing his jacket firmly against her side as though the force of his hands could stop the blood that seemed to seep no matter what he did, and in those tense minutes he felt time slow down around him, every second stretching like an eternity as he prayed to hear the sound of sirens that would mean help was on the way, and during those moments his mind kept flashing to Emily, who was watching from the garage doorway with fear written all over her face. And he forced himself to stay strong because he knew if he looked weak, she would crumble, and she needed him to be solid like the oak tree the car had struck. The officer's breathing was faint, her eyes fluttering open for only brief seconds before closing again, and Tom kept speaking to her in a calm, steady voice, telling her she was safe, that she was not alone, that she only needed to keep fighting for a little longer. Max stayed close, his body pressed to the ground like a soldier standing guard, and every time the officer's breaths faltered, the dog whined softly, as though willing her not to give up. Finally, after what felt like forever, the distant wail of sirens reached Tom's ears, and relief swept over him like a wave, though he didn't ease his pressure on the wound or his steady words of encouragement, because he had seen enough in those minutes to know how fragile her condition was. The ambulance screeched to a stop near the garage, and two paramedics rushed toward him with bags of equipment, kneeling quickly beside the officer while Tom pulled back just enough to let them work, his hands shaking slightly now that he knew professionals had taken over. Emily ran to him, clutching his arm, her little face pale with worry, and he wrapped one arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as they watched the paramedics stabilize the woman, fit an oxygen mask over her face, and lift her carefully onto a stretcher. The police arrived only moments later, their cars pulling up with flashing lights that filled the quiet road with a strange glow, and officers jumped out, some directing traffic, others rushing to the scene. One officer, a tall man with gray hair and a firm voice, approached Tom and asked what had happened, and Tom explained quickly, his words clipped because his mind was still on the woman who was now being loaded into the ambulance. The officer nodded, thanked him for his fast action, and promised someone would follow up later, then hurried away to coordinate with the paramedics. Tom stood there, Emily pressed against him, Max at his feet, and he felt a heaviness in his chest as he watched the ambulance doors close, the sirens starting again as the vehicle sped toward the hospital, carrying with it the fragile life of a stranger who had suddenly become important to him in ways he could not explain. When the lights faded into the distance, the street grew quiet again, and Tom led Emily back inside, though neither of them could shake the image of the officer's pale face and weak breaths. Emily asked in a soft, trembling voice, "Daddy, is she going to die?" And Tom knelt in front of her, holding her shoulders gently, looking into her tearful eyes, and said with a firm but gentle tone, "We did everything we could, and now the doctors will help her. We have to believe she's going to be okay." He hugged her tightly, and Max leaned against them, his steady presence grounding them both. That night, long after Emily had fallen asleep in her bed, Tom sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the wall as he replayed the scene over and over, wondering if he had done enough, if pressing his jacket against her wound had really made a difference, and though he tried to push the doubts away, they kept circling in his mind. He had seen plenty of car accidents in his life, working near the road as he did, but never before had one reached so close, never before had he felt so responsible for whether a stranger lived or died. The next morning the shop was unusually quiet, and Tom found himself glancing at the road often, half expecting to see the same wrecked car or the ambulance lights again, but the road was empty, and the only sounds were the soft scribble of Emily's pencil as she worked on her math homework and the occasional bark from Max when someone passed by. Tom tried to focus on repairing a customer's truck, but his mind kept drifting back to the officer, wondering if she had made it through the night. He did not even know her name, and yet he felt a connection, perhaps because in saving her, he had remembered what it felt like to fight for something bigger than himself, something more than just keeping his small world intact. Late that afternoon, as he was closing up the garage, a police car pulled into the driveway, and for a moment Tom's heart tightened in fear, but the officer who stepped out, the same gray-haired man from the night before, gave him a reassuring smile. The officer introduced himself as Captain Harris and explained that the woman he had helped was Officer Sarah Collins, a young cop who had been chasing a suspect when she lost control of her vehicle, and if Tom had not acted so quickly, she likely would not have survived until help arrived. Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him at those words, and Emily, who had been listening from the doorway, clapped her hands together with a little smile, saying, "I knew she would make it." Max barked once as if agreeing, his tail wagging slowly. Captain Harris thanked Tom again, saying the department was deeply grateful, and though Tom brushed it off with a simple, "Anyone would have done the same," the officer shook his head and said firmly, "No, not everyone would have risked themselves like you did. What you did was brave." Tom didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, and after Harris left, he stood for a long while staring at the road, feeling both humbled and unsettled, because deep down he knew this was not the end of the story, only the beginning. He had stepped into the path of fate, and fate had a way of pulling people into places they never expected to go. That night, as he tucked Emily into bed, she whispered, "Daddy, do you think we'll see her again?" And Tom hesitated for a moment before answering softly, "Maybe we will, Em. Maybe we will." The days that followed the accident were filled with a strange restlessness for Tom, because although his routine at the garage went on as usual with cars coming in for repairs and Emily doing her homework at the little desk in the corner while Max kept watch, his thoughts kept drifting back to Officer Sarah Collins, the young woman whose life had hung by a thread in his arms that night, and though he told himself that he had done what anyone else would have done, deep inside he knew not. Everyone would have rushed into the smoke and broken glass the way he had, and that memory made him feel both uneasy and strangely connected to her even though they had never spoken a real word to each other. He would catch himself staring at the phone sometimes, tempted to call the hospital just to ask if she was all right, but then he would stop, reminding himself that she was a stranger, and strangers had families and friends to care for them, and his job was to look after Emily and the life they had built together, nothing more. Yet despite that logic, every time he closed his eyes he could see her pale face, the way her eyes had fluttered open for a second, as if silently asking him not to let go, and that look haunted him in a way he could not quite explain. Emily noticed her father's distraction and asked more than once if he was thinking about the lady officer, and though Tom tried to brush it off with a smile and a gentle, "Don't worry, Em, she's in good hands," his daughter's curious eyes seemed to know the truth, because children often saw things adults tried to hide. One bright morning, just 3 days after the crash, as Tom was bent over an engine with grease on his hands and sweat on his forehead, a familiar sound made him pause the crunch of tires on gravel outside the shop, and when he looked up, he saw a black and white police cruiser pulling into the driveway. Max barked once, then trotted to the door, his tail wagging cautiously, while Emily looked up from her notebook, her eyes wide with curiosity. Tom wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out just as the car door opened, and to his surprise, it wasn't Captain Harris this time but a young woman in plain clothes, her arm in a sling, her step slow but steady, and though her face was pale, her eyes were clear and strong. It was Officer Sarah Collins. For a moment Tom froze, not sure what to say, but Emily gasped with delight and ran forward before he could stop her, exclaiming, "You're alive. I knew you would be okay." Sarah let out a small laugh, wincing slightly from the movement, and she knelt carefully to hug the little girl with her free arm, whispering, "Thanks to your dad, I am." Tom felt a strange warmth in his chest as he watched them, and when Sarah stood again, she gave him a look that held more gratitude than words could ever say. "I had to come by," she said softly, her voice steady despite the weakness in her body. "The doctors told me if you hadn't acted when you did, I wouldn't be here. I don't remember much, but I remember your voice telling me to hold on. That meant more than you'll ever know." Tom shifted uncomfortably, not used to praise, and muttered, "I just did what anyone would have done." Sarah shook her head firmly and replied, "No, not everyone would have done that. You saved my life." For a long moment they stood there in silence, the hum of the garage in the background, Max sniffing at Sarah's hand as if giving his own approval, and Emily watching them with bright, curious eyes. Finally, Sarah smiled faintly and added, "The department wants to recognize you for what you did, but I wanted to thank you myself first." Tom felt awkward under her gaze, but he nodded, and they moved into the shop where Emily eagerly offered Sarah a chair. They sat together, the conversation flowing slowly at first but gradually warming as Sarah spoke about her job, how she had joined the force because she wanted to make a difference, and how the chase that night had gone wrong so quickly she hardly remembered what happened. Tom listened quietly, occasionally nodding, his rough hands folded on the table, while Emily peppered her with innocent questions like, "Do you carry a real gun, and are you scared when you chase bad guys?" Sarah answered with patience and humor, her smile softening her strong features, and in those moments Tom found himself noticing not just her bravery but also her kindness, the way she spoke to Emily as though the little girl was the most important person in the room. After a while, Sarah stood, wincing slightly as she adjusted her sling, and said she didn't want to take more of their time, but before she left, she looked at Tom and said quietly, "I owe you more than I can ever repay, but I want you to know you'll always have a friend in me. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you can call me." Tom nodded, not trusting himself to say much, but something in his chest tightened with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, something like hope mixed with fear. Emily hugged Sarah tightly before she left, and Max barked as though to say goodbye, and when the cruiser pulled out of the driveway, Tom stood there a long while, watching the dust settle, his mind filled with thoughts he couldn't quite untangle. That night, as he tucked Emily into bed, she whispered sleepily, "Daddy, I like her. She's strong and nice, just like Mom was," and Tom's heart clenched at the mention of his late wife, but he kissed Emily's forehead and replied softly, "Yeah, she is." Later, when the house was quiet and Max lay at his feet, Tom sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where Sarah had sat just hours before, and for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, life was offering him a second chance at something he thought he had lost forever. The weeks that followed Sarah's visit to the garage brought small changes to Tom's quiet life, changes he hadn't expected but ones that seemed to arrive naturally, like rain after a long dry season, because Sarah began stopping by now and then, sometimes in her cruiser while on duty just to check in, and sometimes in plain clothes on her days off, always with a smile that brightened the small garage and a calmness that made Emily light up with joy, and though Tom tried to act as though it was nothing out of the ordinary, deep inside he felt those visits stirring something in him he thought had been buried forever. Sarah had a way of talking that made even the hardest subjects feel light, and she carried a strength in her presence that reminded Tom of what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself, something he had almost forgotten since his wife's death. Emily adored her, asking endless questions about police work and hanging on to every story Sarah told, from helping lost children find their parents at the fair to chasing thieves through the streets, and Sarah answered with patience, her laughter ringing through the garage like music, filling the space with a warmth that had been missing for years. Max too seemed to approve, always wagging his tail when she arrived and sitting at her feet like he had known her forever, which in Tom's mind was no small thing, because he trusted Max's instincts more than anyone's. As days turned into weeks, Sarah's visits grew longer, and sometimes she would join them for dinner, sitting at the small wooden table with Emily chatting happily beside her and Tom listening quietly, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he watched the two of them bond as if they had always known each other. Sarah never pushed, never overstepped, and that made Tom respect her even more, because she seemed to understand his guarded heart, the walls he had built to protect himself and Emily from more pain, and instead of trying to break those walls down, she simply stood patiently on the other side, letting trust build little by little. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah lingered at the table with Tom, sipping tea while Max lay quietly at their feet, and for the first time they spoke not just about the accident or her recovery but about life, about what it meant to keep moving after loss, about how lonely nights could feel even when you had people around you, and in that soft, honest conversation Tom felt something shift inside him, a recognition that he wasn't as alone as he had convinced himself he was. He found himself looking at Sarah not just as the officer he had saved but as a person with her own scars, her own struggles, and perhaps even her own need for connection. The town soon began to notice the bond forming between the mechanic, his daughter, and the young cop, and though small towns always had whispers, most of the talk carried warmth rather than judgment, because people respected Tom for what he had done and admired Sarah for her dedication, and many quietly thought that maybe fate had brought them together for a reason. Emily, innocent and hopeful, often asked when Sarah would visit next, and when Tom teased her about liking Sarah so much, she replied with a grin, "She makes us happy, Daddy, and she makes you smile," a truth so simple that Tom didn't have the heart to deny it. One Saturday, Sarah invited them both, along with Max, to a police community event in the park, and though Tom was reluctant at first, worried about being out of place among uniforms and crowds, Emily's excitement won him over, and they went. The day turned out better than he imagined, with children laughing, officers showing their equipment, and Sarah proudly introducing Emily to her colleagues, telling them how brave she had been the night of the accident, calling her the little helper who called 911, which made Emily beam with pride. Tom stood back, watching his daughter's joy, and for the first time in years, he felt a lightness in his chest, as if maybe happiness was something he could feel again, not just for Emily's sake but for his own. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the event wound down, Sarah walked with Tom while Emily ran ahead with Max, and she said softly, "You know, when I was lying there in that car, I thought it was over for me, but then I heard your voice, and I believed for the first time in my life that maybe someone out there really cared if I lived. That feeling has stayed with me, Tom." He looked at her, caught off guard by the raw honesty in her words, and though part of him wanted to retreat into silence, another part of him, the part that had long been buried, wanted to step closer. "I only did what I had to do," he replied quietly, but Sarah shook her head gently and said, "You did more than that, you gave me back my life." The weight of her words settled deep inside him, and though he didn't answer, the look they shared said enough, a silent understanding that something unspoken was growing between them. That night, after dropping Sarah off at her apartment, Tom drove home with Emily asleep in the back seat and Max resting his head near her feet, and he felt a calmness in his heart that he hadn't felt in years, a calmness that whispered maybe he was finally ready to let someone new into their lives. As he carried Emily to bed and watched her sleep peacefully, he thought of Sarah's smile, her laughter, and the strength in her eyes, and he realized she wasn't just a passing figure in their story, she was becoming part of it. The quiet house felt different that night, not empty but alive with the possibility of change, and Tom, sitting at the table with Max at his side, allowed himself, for the first time since his wife's death, to imagine a future that wasn't defined only by loss but by new beginnings too. The months that followed brought a quiet but profound change to Tom Miller's life, a shift that felt like the slow blooming of spring after a long winter, because in the company of Sarah Collins, Emily, and of course Max, the world suddenly seemed fuller, warmer, and more alive than it had been in years, and Tom realized that life had a way of returning hope to those who thought it was lost forever, though it came gently, in small moments, rather than all at once. He noticed it in the way Emily laughed when Sarah arrived at the garage with a small gift or a funny story from work, in the way Max seemed to wag his tail a little faster whenever the young officer's car pulled into the driveway, and even in the way his own heart felt lighter, no longer burdened by the weight of grief and routine alone, because Sarah's presence brought a kind of quiet strength, a sense that they were all part of something larger, a small family shaped not by blood alone but by trust, courage, and care. Emily, of course, had grown even closer to Sarah, often clinging to her hand or rushing to show her little drawings she had made, and Sarah, in turn, would sit patiently with her, telling her stories about her work, or sharing small lessons about kindness, bravery, and honesty, always careful to make Emily feel seen and valued, which Tom admired quietly from the background, grateful that his daughter had a role model who encouraged both her heart and her mind. Over time, Sarah and Tom found themselves talking more about everything, from their favorite books to dreams they had long set aside, their conversations stretching long into the evenings, filled with laughter, shared memories, and even moments of silence that spoke more than words ever could, and though neither of them rushed, both felt the invisible thread of connection growing stronger each day, a bond forged by the life-saving act that had brought them together and strengthened by mutual respect and understanding that few people ever experience. One Saturday, Tom and Sarah, along with Emily and Max, went on a picnic to a quiet park on the outskirts of town, a place where the air was fresh and the sound of birds filled the sky, and as they spread a blanket under a large oak tree, Emily ran ahead with Max chasing her, her laughter echoing in the open space, while Tom and Sarah sat together, sharing sandwiches and smiles, talking softly about nothing and everything at once, and in that simple moment, Tom realized he could feel happiness. Not only for Emily but for himself as well, something he had thought impossible after years of struggle, and he glanced at Sarah with a smile that reflected relief, gratitude, and a growing warmth he could not deny. Sarah, noticing the expression, reached over and lightly touched his hand, a simple gesture that sent a comforting spark through him, and for the first time in a long while, Tom allowed himself to imagine a future where he and Emily were no longer just surviving but truly living, surrounded by friendship, trust, and perhaps even love. Emily eventually returned, tired from running but glowing with joy, and she flopped onto the blanket between them, arms wide, asking for stories about Sarah's police adventures, and Sarah laughed, sharing small, harmless tales about her work, and Tom watched, feeling a sense of completeness, knowing that for Emily, these moments were just as important as the safety and love he provided, because happiness, he realized, was found in shared experiences, laughter, and the bonds that could not be broken even by life's toughest trials. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Tom noticed Sarah standing and stretching, a small smile on her face, and he found himself offering to walk her back to her car, a small act of care that felt natural after everything they had been through together, and as they walked side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing, they talked about hopes, fears, and dreams that had been tucked away, sometimes lightly, sometimes seriously, and each word, each glance, seemed to cement the trust that had grown between them. By the time they reached her car, the sky was deepening into a soft evening blue, the first stars beginning to show, and Sarah turned to him with a quiet sincerity, saying, "Tom, thank you for everything, not just that night, but for letting me be part of your life now. It means more than you know." Tom, feeling an emotion he hadn't acknowledged in a long time, simply nodded and replied, "No, thank you. You brought something back to us that we didn't even know we needed." She smiled gently, and in that moment, words felt unnecessary, because the understanding between them spoke louder than any sentence could. Back at home, Tom tucked Emily into bed and kissed her forehead, promising to tell her a story tomorrow morning about heroes, courage, and kindness, stories she loved so much, and as he watched her drift into sleep, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years, a sense that the world, despite its challenges, still had goodness, love, and second chances to offer. Max curled up at the foot of her bed, his soft breathing a reminder that family came in all shapes and sizes, some furry, some human, all bound together by trust and care. Later, Tom and Sarah spoke on the phone, planning a small outing for the next weekend, and the thought made him smile, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt since before Emily's mother passed, a promise of new memories to be made, laughter to be shared, and perhaps even a life together that wasn't just about survival but about joy, companionship, and healing. Weeks turned into months, and the bond between Tom, Emily, and Sarah grew stronger with each passing day, filled with moments both ordinary and extraordinary, like cooking dinner together, celebrating birthdays, and sharing quiet evenings watching the stars while Max lay nearby, protective and content. The small town began to see a new kind of family, one not bound by conventional definitions but by love, respect, and shared experiences, and quietly, many admired the way these lives had intertwined, how courage and kindness had led to connection and how one single act of bravery had changed all of them forever. Tom often reflected on that fateful night, remembering the terror, the urgency, and the fragile life of a stranger in his arms, and he realized that without that accident, he may never have met Sarah, never discovered the capacity for joy and hope that had been waiting quietly in his heart, and never allowed Emily to feel the warmth of another caring adult in her life. Max, ever loyal, remained the quiet guardian of their home, always watching, always protective, and in his silent way, seemed to understand that life had changed for the better. One evening, as the sun set once again over the quiet town, Tom, Sarah, Emily, and Max sat together on the porch, sharing lemonade and watching the sky change colors, and Tom felt a full sense of gratitude for the unexpected path that had led them here, a path filled with fear, courage, and ultimately love. Sarah reached over, holding his hand, and Emily leaned against her father's shoulder, Max at their feet, and in that simple moment, Tom knew that life, despite its challenges and heartbreaks, had given them a second chance not just to survive, but to truly live, laugh, and love together, forming a family stronger than he had ever imagined possible, one built on bravery, kindness, and the quiet power of connection. And as the stars began to twinkle above, he whispered softly to himself, "This is exactly where we're meant to be."